This slide summarizes some of the major differences, comparison and contrasting between raster and vector data. I'm not going to go through the whole list of things here. You can certainly read them, but just in general, raster data being what it is, typically a simpler data structure than vector information. Raster requires more storage space no matter what than vector information. It can take a while to do reprojection of those compared to vector data. That's not so much of a problem these days, except that with very high resolution rasters, it's going to take quite a while to do reprojections on those. They have different analytical properties. Vectors definitely more suited for accurately describing boundaries and dealing with network type informations, flow between locations, things like that. And raster is much better suited for looking at continuous surfaces across space. And as we'll see later on, very handy for doing certain types of analysis with different data types. And raster information, inherently because of the nature of its geometry, is not so great for describing precise location on the Earth's surface and what things look like, other than when you're zoomed out, perhaps, and then you can see what the landscape looks like when you zoom in. Well, it's nice and blocky. It's maybe like Minecraft to a certain extent. Vector data is much more precise in the way it describes things and very good for discrete information on the Earth's surface. Not so good for if you're trying to do something comparable to an image like a photo or something like that taken from an airplane or space. Raster is much better than vector for that. And so anyway, each of these has benefits. Each of them has drawbacks. We use both of these major data set types in geographic analysis for just about everything that you do. It's probably going to be a mixture of both. And so mixing and matching for different purposes, knowing what the characteristics of the data types are is very important, and knowing the limitations and benefits of each of them is really critical to knowing what's the best approach to take to solve any particular geographic problem, to work on any particular project. You need to know the data types characteristics backwards and forwards and know what's the best approach to take, what's the best data type to use. And then from that follows logically, where do I get it? Where do I get the good, really truthful information that I need in raster or vector format to help solve my problem or help get a project towards completion? Those are topics for another day. So a visual review of discrete and continuous. Discrete data describing here, in this case, land use patterns, and below, road network. So remember that discrete information is for describing like individual objects or features on the Earth's surface. You can see visually the limitation of using raster data, especially at coarse resolution, for those purposes. It's not very well suited for it, for describing the boundaries between things, and therefore really describing well the area and length relationships that we might be interested in. Continuous data is when we have a surface that doesn't have any breaks, it's not discrete, and so with many different environmental variables, rasters are very good for that. There really aren't gaps in elevation. There are differences in elevation, but there's no place on the Earth's surface that doesn't have an elevation value above or below mean sea level. So a raster is really good for describing that. Really good at describing temperature patterns, precipitation patterns, those types of variables, or even land cover types, perhaps, as a surface, given the limitations of the raster cell resolution. And finally, really good rasters are really good at showing us what actually exists on the Earth's surface in image formats. That's what a digital camera does. That's what your modern phone will do, probably. Most modern phones have a camera these days, and what it's doing is remote sensing. It takes an image composed of pixels, a raster that combines the red, green, and blue radiation reflecting off of everything that you're taking the picture of, and then being captured by your remote sensing device, your phone. And so you get a continuous raster of the scene. And if you put in an image and manipulation program, you can zoom in on it just like you can zoom in on a satellite image and see the pixel resolution. And given the distance that you were away from the features that you imaged, then you can see what happens at the or the base resolution of the image. When you zoom all the way in, you can see individual pixels. What can you actually resolve in that image? That's what resolution is all about. What can you resolve? So here, with a high resolution image, we can resolve individual features. We can see them quite distinctly in the black and white image that we see here. All right. Now compare that, for example, with the raster over on the left. The resolution there is not so great, and it's not showing that information with a lot of detail. It's very coarse. Okay. So fine, coarse, high resolution, low resolution. Is it discrete or continuous? Those are characteristics to know of your data sets and to know what they mean, and what they mean for the type of analysis that you can do, and what you can say about the accuracy and precision of the data that you used and the outputs that came from them. So here's an example of what a multi-band raster would look like in ArcGIS in your ArcCatalog interface. Okay, so we've got a thematic mapper image from 24th of September 1998, and it's telling us that it's in the UTM format and it's in band interleave, BIL extension. It doesn't really matter what that extension is, don't worry about that too much, but band interleave is just one form that we use to write the raster information in the actual file. So the sequence of numbers that actually go into the file is what the BIL is telling us. It operates like any other raster that you might see, but or use in an analysis. When we open that raster up, the secondary feature that we're seeing is the names of all of the bands that are in that raster, band 1 through 7. And so 1, 2, and 3, red, green, and blue. In reverse, actually, it's blue, green, and red for 1, 2, 3. In combination, those are showing us what the surface looks like out there in color. That's what that particular area looks like. It was a thematic mapper satellite image. So that's a thematic mapper is a satellite series that's operated by the USGS here in the United States. They've been up in orbit successively for decades, taking images of the Earth's surface. That's a little bit beside the point, but anyway, that's what it is for context. And so each of those bands, as we mentioned before, contains one environmental characteristic about this particular study area. 1, 2, and 3 are blue, green, and red radiation. And the other bands that you see here are most likely the bands that are showing us infrared radiation in different wavelength segments. Band 4 is definitely a near infrared band, and that's one that commonly gets used in a certain type of analysis that we do for vegetation called an NDVI, which you'll get exposed to later on in the class. So anyhow, here's what that looks like if you run across one. And any satellite image or digital air photo is going to be comprised of at least 3 bands for red, green, and blue, and the other ones then may be smaller like samples of the red, green, and blue, or they could be other forms of radiation. In this case, the infrared bands that we use in more advanced analysis than simple visual analysis. To find the property summaries for your rasters, you right-click on the raster in the table of contents, look at the Source tab on Layer Properties, just like you would for vector data, and as the slide indicates, scroll down to read what the information is. But right at the top should be a summary telling you how many rows and columns are in the raster, if it's multiband or not, what the cell size is, and it gives you an idea about how much disk space it's occupying. In this case, whether it's continuous or floating point is in there. So anyway, that's what that's the interface they would use just to see what's in there, and that tells you the physical properties about the data. It doesn't give you the true metadata. That's something you have to go through the metadata interface and tab to get that. So jumping ahead just a little bit to the next lecture set, let's think a little bit about raster analysis, and we need to make an important point here before we get to that the entire topic. Raster analysis goes on a cell-by-cell basis in one or more input grids, and there's different ways that happens. We'll explore that in more detail in the next lecture set. Local functions go cell by cell. Neighborhood functions operate on a set of cells. Global functions operate on an entire raster at once. In order for any of this stuff to work, however, the cells must be the same size, and they must line up spatially. They should be as close to clones of each other spatially as possible. And older software sets and older versions of ArcGIS and other software would require that all the input rasters have exactly the same size, shape, and alignment or coordinate system underneath them, or the analysis would basically fail. Okay, and so under that approach, which is still the best way to go, it's still the best to use that. Something we would often have to do is we'd need to resample if we were mixing and matching different size rasters. You always have to resample to the coarsest cell size when using multiple rasters within an analytical workflow or procedure. And that's still the case. You need to resample to the coarsest cell size. And that basically means that you cannot mix a 60-meter resolution grid with a 30-meter resolution grid. You don't just split the 60-meter grid into 30-meter pixels and say, oh, look, now I've got a 30-meter grid. In science, that doesn't work because the data wasn't collected at that scale, at the 30-meter scale. It was collected and generated at the 60-meter scale. So in order to have defensible techniques based on scientific principles, we need to resample the 30-meter grid, which is finer resolution. We need to make it and convert it into a coarser resolution grid. So we take the 30-meter grid and we transform it by resampling into a 60-meter grid, and then we run the analysis. So when you're combining different rasters from different sources, you need to check the cell sizes. Whichever one is the worst is the best that you can do. So you must resample all of the other ones to match that, the worst resolution, and then conduct your analysis. Now, in ArcGIS, the way it's programmed these days, this may happen automatically, where you are resampling to the worst resolution, and your output will be the worst resolution of all the inputs. So a smart GIS analyst will know ahead of time and will take steps to ensure that they're using best practices. If they're not, then the output may not be what they expected. So, as always, you should inspect your outputs, make sure it was what you were expecting to see, And if the results are not what you were expecting, you need to step back and say, how come that occurred? And it may be that ArcGIS is doing the job that you were supposed to do as a GIS analyst ahead of time to resample your data. But it may not tell you that it's doing that, so you need to watch for it, you need to check it. And as always, you need to be aware of what is happening with your data whenever you do something that transforms it in any way. So resampling is taking the finer resolution data and converting it into lower resolution data. So here we have a nice example. Two different grids, one at finer resolution, one at coarser resolution, and we need to combine them together for some reason in our analysis. So we resample, we use the ArcGIS command to resample the grid from finer resolution to coarser resolution, from nice detailed information to kind of a worse level of detailed information. Okay. This is what we need to do if we're mixing and matching data sets that have different cell size resolutions. You don't get to just pick the 30 meter and say, I'm going to stick with the 30 meter all the way through, when I've got a 60 meter or a 120 meter or a kilometer grid that we're combining together. You have to resample that finer, high resolution data and make it coarser, lower resolution. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this. The methods that we use for resampling are three major ones, are built into most GIS and remote sensing packages: nearest neighbor, bilinear, and cubic convolution. Nearest neighbor is best for categorical or nominal level data, and what it will do is pick whatever is closest in the input raster to the cell center. So the cell center of the output grid being the lower resolution result of resampling, that cell center, whatever it's closest to in the input higher resolution data set, is the value it will contain. So looking at the example here up on top, the top row on the left, the cell center is going to absorb the value from the green pixel, whatever that value is. The top center pixel will absorb the value from the more sandy colored pixel. And the one in the upper right will absorb the value from the more brick colored pixel. Okay, and that's nearest neighbor. It's the easiest thing to do. It's appropriate and best for categorical levels of data. When you're dealing with surfaces are best resampled using bilinear techniques. In this case here, what we're talking about with bilinear is that it will take a neighborhood of cells, usually, as it indicates here, a 2x2 combination nearest the output cell center, and it will use the distances from that cell center to the input cell centers, and the values of those input cell centers will be averaged using the distances and the values as weights, and it will compute essentially think of it as an average of all those values, the distances away from the point locations and the values of the point locations as magnitudes, and then it will compute an average of those things. Okay. Cubic convolution kind of works on that principle, except it uses the nearest 16 cells. So it's a very powerful way to compute things. However, it also really smooths the data. Okay, so it's going to really hammer the data a lot, and it will reduce the highs and the lows, the peaks and the valleys, the extreme high values and extreme low values, and it will make a flatter type of a surface. So it's something that I really don't recommend using unless the data analysis protocol or procedure that you are following for your project indicates this is the technique to use. Okay, otherwise, you should probably default back in almost all other cases. If it's a surface and you need to retain the surface as continuous data, bilinear resampling is the best selection to take. If it's just categorical information, nearest neighbor works just fine. Okay, so again, what these things are doing is they take that input grid value and they apply it to the output grid cell center based upon the location distance from the input cells and the new output cells. So working with rasters, really critical point. Don't use Windows Explorer to drop and drag raster files. Use ArcCatalog. Move these things, copy, move, and delete rasters with ArcCatalog. And there's reasons for doing that. The most important one is that you don't know all of the subsidiary files within your folder structure. And there are going to be little files that ArcGIS creates to help operate the rasters. If you delete them using Windows, you're going to miss all those other little pieces. You're going to clutter up your data set and potentially create errors. So you use ArcCatalog. ArcCatalog will move every single little file that's related to the raster data set. It will delete every single little file that's related to the raster data set and remove it from your project folder. So as your main textbook author Price indicates, the best practice is to create a geodatabase and store analysis outputs from your rasters within that geodatabase. Simplifies the management process in some ways quite a bit, especially with regard to copying and deleting them. And so my advice is, until you get used to using geodatabases, definitely get your handle on how single rasters work and use that, use the ArcCatalog interface primarily to manage those. When you get more familiar with geodatabases, then start using them. And if you're already familiar with them, great. Use them to store and manage your raster data sets. It is handy to know how to manage them independently outside of a geodatabase. And so I would say start with that. And when you get comfortable with it, then move into storing things in geodatabases. And there's a link below that will jump out to more information about that particular idea. So, word of caution as we end out this lecture, ArcGIS may resample your rasters during your analytical procedures as it sees fit without giving you any warning whatsoever. And resampling degrades your raster quality. Remember, resampling goes for the coarsest of the input data sets as the maximum resolution of your output. So be aware of what's happening. Your textbook author and I agree on these ideas. So from the beginning of a project, keep your analytical data in the same projection, and if they're rasters, with the same extents, the same spatial extent if you can, the same cell sizes, definitely. If you need to, use your environment settings to enforce common grids using or being produced with the characteristics that you want for anything that you do analytically. So the environment settings are basically filters that you apply to your analysis when you're in raster-based analysis. Okay, and they will help keep your control over the outputs and make sure that you know when resampling is occurring, what it's doing, what your output is, and that you record that information so the next data user will understand what you did and be able to interpret your data appropriately. Okay, and so with that, here's a big warning about working with rasters. You must document your work and provide that information to whoever the next user happens to be.